We are in a tumultuous time. We're at a precipice where we can either answer the call for change or allow business as usual to continue. We're seeing it around us, a worldwide, not just nationwide, a worldwide call for change. In particular, a call for a stop to police violence, to use of excessive force, and for structural policy and budgetary change in how we reimagine public safety. We say it all the time. It's one of our greatest strengths that we are one of the most diverse counties in the nation, with 4 of the top 10 most diverse cities. But that also means, with a majority community of color, we are not immune to the systemic and structural racism that manifests in so many ways, but in relation to this bill in particular, in our criminal justice system. We know that 55% of the use of force incidents by police in our county in 2018 were against Black residents, despite only representing 19% of the population. I'm going to say it again, 55% of situations where force was used in our county, actually higher than the national average at 52%, were against our Black residents. This reality is not always spoken of because, like many things in our county, policing is experienced differently depending on who you are and where you live. So when people have watched with horror, all people, the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police and the knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, people were jarred into action. And then it makes people self-reflect, or could that happen here? Are we at risk? One of the first things I thought about after just complete sadness and anger was a case here in Montgomery County last year where Officer Morris dangerously and aggressively kneed a suspect while he was handcuffed and restrained outside of an Aspen Hill McDonald's, kneed him in the head. I think of Robert White, who we just commemorated 2 years ago, was killed walking on a walk that he had done thousands of times before in his own neighborhood, and was pursued because he had a ripped jacket that ended in his death, being shot 7 times. I think of Fanon Burhay, who just weeks ago, 30-year-old Eritrean American resident of our county, who was shot and killed when de-escalation techniques were not used. And then I think about the work that we've done on this council. The first bill I introduced, the first bill of this council, the Law Enforcement Trust and Transparency Act, unanimously approved, in effect as of this year, to require independent investigations in police-involved deaths. The community policing bill that my colleagues, Councilmembers Navarro and Rice, put forward with support of so many. The Racial Justice and Social Equity Act, all aimed, the resolution we approved today, declaring racism a public health emergency, all aimed at moving away from these type of horrific events. And I've said it, in that case, outside of the Aspen Hill McDonald's, if that young man was paralyzed or killed, which could have happened with the force of that knee, we would have been Minneapolis a year ago. And the same officers stood around and watched it happen. And so when we talk about, could it happen here? Yes, it could. And then just 2 days ago, in the midst of nationwide and worldwide protests in all 50 states and in almost every country on the globe, saying Black Lives Matter and protesting police violence, we have to deal and incur another death in Atlanta of Rashard Brooks, shot twice in the back after he was found sleeping in a Wendy's drive-thru. And yes, he had something to drink. And yes, he offered to go home to his sister's house after a very calm conversation with officers. But he wasn't afforded that right. And then he was shot in the back and killed. These incidents happen all too often when we have interactions with law enforcement. As I mentioned, of the force that's used against Black people in this country, 52% of all use of force incidents by law enforcement nationally are against Black people. It's 55% in Montgomery County. We have an issue. Of the 15,000 arrests in 2018, 50% of them were Black people. When you add Latino residents, you get over to 75% of the arrests in 2018 were people of color in this county. That's unacceptable, and we need to answer why that's the question. And we know that institutional racism is at the core of that. So when we think about George Floyd, when we think about the action we need to take here locally, I think about those events, and I'm compelled to act. I'm so proud to be working with Council Members Rice, Councilmember Navarro, Councilmember Albernaz as the co-leads on this bill. I think it's significant that as the members of color on the council that we led this effort to put forward a serious and significant package of use of force policy reforms that will keep people safer. I want to outline just those briefly now before I pause. This bill will prohibit deadly force. It will instruct the police chief to create a new use of force policy. We have one now. It hasn't been updated since 2016. That prohibits the use of deadly force unless absolutely necessary as a last resort after reasonable alternatives to use the force have been exhausted, to use less force or no force have been exhausted, to prevent against imminent threat or serious bodily injury. And I want to talk about what reasonable alternatives means briefly. That's in the bill. It means tactics and methods used by law enforcement to effectuate an arrest that do not unreasonably increase the risk posed to the law enforcement officer or another person, including verbal communication, distance, warnings, de-escalation tactics, tactical repositioning, and other tactics and techniques intended to stabilize the situation and reduce the immediacy of the risk so that more time, options, and resources can be called upon to resolve the situation without the use of force. That's what this policy must do and must train and call on officers to do. It also importantly prohibits chokeholds and neck restraints like that we saw on George Floyd and the knee to the neck that we saw on Mr. Pessoa, done by Officer Morris, who was rightly charged and convicted of assault. It also requires officer intervention to stop another officer when they witness them using excessive force, violating department policy, or committing a crime. I'm glad to see that after our urging and this council's urging last year after this case that I mentioned from Mr. Pessoa, the department has worked on a policy that is similar to this, and hopefully will be in line with the law when we pass this law. Another important point, though, is that this provision in this law also will protect an officer from any retaliation or punishment if they are acting reasonably and interfering with another officer's actions. We don't want officers who think something wrong is happening to hesitate. We've seen that in multiple cases here and across the country. The chief will have 60 days to implement this new policy. So I'm very glad we're taking this step. It's a far-reaching step. It's modeled off of components of it are modeled off the state of California, which last year became one of the first states in the country to raise the standard of when deadly force can be used from reasonableness standard to necessary. We know the city of Seattle has taken similar action, and when they did, saw a decrease in deaths of residents. At the same time, no additional injuries to officers, which is also very important. So I thank everyone for listening and watching and for writing in and engaging on this bill. We must protect all of our residents, and that includes our Black residents, our brown residents, our immigrant residents, everyone who disproportionately has contact with the police. And these policies aren't just going to protect the Black community or the communities of color. It will protect all residents, which is what we want. We want de-escalation to be the rule, not the exception, and not depend on who you are. So as we declared today, racism and public health crisis, this bill is a direct response and one of the many steps we're going to need to take to make sure that we are responding to that emergency. A lot more remains to be done in training and what we incentivize in policing. not just tickets and arrests, but positive outcomes. And we're going to be working on all that. But this is a direct response on the accountability side and on the use of force side to protect life for all of our residents. Finally, I want to thank all my council colleagues, every other member, Council President Katz, Vice President Hucker, Councilmember Glass, Councilmember Reamer, for co-sponsoring this legislation. Councilmember Hucker, without you, we couldn't get this done. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I know we'll have robust debate. I yield back.